Being that it's a building that not anyone can just walk into, one might wonder if it's sort of like dark and mysterious, like I've experienced whenever I've entered into certain Masonic buildings. Hello Saints, my name is Jeff. I am a pastor in Utah exploring everything I can about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And recently I've had a series of experiences that have really been a lot of firsts for me. I've gone to a Latter-day Saint church service for the first time. I've been in the buildings for the first time. I've been reading through the Book of Mormon for the first time. And I've also gone inside 3 Latter-day Saint temples for the very first time. And doing so has been incredibly eye-opening for me. So now that I've gone through 3, I thought it would be a good idea for me to make a video where I sort of compare and contrast my experiences and to just provide my honest observations and perceptions of my understanding of temples, what they're all about, and how I view them now that I've toured 3 of them. So let's dive in. The first most fundamental question that I remember my past self wondering is, what is a temple? I remember driving by the St. Louis temple on a regular basis when I lived in St. Louis, quite simply wondering, what is that place and why does it exist? Well, I've now come to the understanding that a Latter-day Saint temple is a sacred space that Latter-day Saints designate to carry out specific ordinances that are necessary in keeping our promises and making covenants with God. And more specifically in temples, this is where proxy work is done for people who have already died. In other words, everyone needs to go through certain ordinances according to what God has commanded, but if somebody has never received the opportunity to conduct those ordinances and then they die, Latter-day Saints go to temples on a regular basis and stand in as proxies to go through a series of ordinances on behalf of people who have already passed on so that they might have an opportunity to receive the plan of salvation and to be on a path of progression and exaltation. I remember another question I wondered quite a bit prior to me actually going in and learning about temples is, why can't just anyone enter into a temple? And this is because Latter-day Saints have a very strong conviction that one must be worthy in order to enter into a temple. They must go through preliminary steps of not just belief and baptism, but also coming under a priesthood authority of individuals within the church to make sure that they are worthy and ready to carry out certain covenants on this path. And something else that's important to point out is that there's the belief that there are very sacred things that take place within the temple, specifically in 1 or 2 of the ordinances that are meant to remain within a sacred space. So this is why Latter-day Saints go into temples, and as they're making these covenants, there are certain points where they covenant to not reveal certain things that take place or that are shared with them while they are in the temple. And this highlights a really important motivation behind Latter-day Saints having temples, and that is because they believe that God wants there to be sacred and holy spaces on earth where we can enter into these spaces and experience the holiness of God and the sacred things He has for us. So then you might be wondering, well, then how did some pastor get access to go into 3 temples? Well, it's not because I'm all that special, though, but it's mainly because whenever a temple is first built, prior to it being dedicated by church leadership, they do invite the public into the temples so they can see everything that goes on in there. They also do this whenever a temple is renovated. So one of the temples that I went through was the St. George Temple, which is the oldest temple in Utah, but it went through a recent renovation, and prior to its dedication, I was able to go through the temple and tour it, which I was really glad I was able to because it was a very unique temple compared to the other 2, but we'll talk about that more in just a second. To that point, let's talk about what I observed in these temples and where there were similarities and differences. The first temple I went through was in Saratoga Springs, Utah. It is a brand new temple, and I went through it with a Latter-day Saint friend, Kurt Frankum, a pastor friend of mine named Nate Fox, who pastors at Lifestone in Harriman, Utah, and most importantly, with my wife. We both were able to go through this temple, and for the first time, to really take in everything that we saw and share with one another what our impressions were. In the Saratoga Springs temple, it just seemed brand new. It seemed very modern and contemporary. It was very ornate. Being that it's a building that not anyone can just walk into, one might wonder if it's sort of like dark and mysterious, like I've experienced whenever I've entered into certain Masonic buildings or other fraternities or secret societies. But that wasn't at all what we experienced. It was bright, it was wide open. There was a lot of detail when it came to the symbolism, whether it be around the baptismal font or whether it be in the celestial room or even in the room where sealings take place. There seemed to be thoughtful, intentional meaning behind almost every detail that existed. The second temple I went through was down in St. George, Utah, and this was the temple that is quite old. In fact, it was constructed around the time of Brigham Young himself. And as a result, it possessed a very unique quality that was distinct from the Saratoga Springs Temple. Because when we walked in, not only did it look more historical, it looked more colonial in a sense. There were more archways and the details seemed to be almost more Victorian or tied to the period that it was built. But even beyond that, this was a building that has stories attached to it. In fact, one in particular that I've talked about in a previous video is the first temple president claiming to have had a vision in the St. George Temple of the founding fathers and other prominent historic figures appearing to him and asking that temple ordinances take place on their behalf. Stories like that didn't exist in the Saratoga Springs Temple because it's brand new. And you could also tell that it was more significant to the people around me who were on the tour with me. Because on this tour, not only did I go with some more Latter-day Saint friends like Kurt Franken from the Leading Saints podcast and Richie Stedman from the Cultural Hall podcast, but the Latter-day Saints who were with me were more vocal about how they remember going through this temple prior to its renovation, or their parents or even themselves being sealed in this temple decades ago. The tour guide also talked about how there were certain rooms that were used in the endowment ceremony to sort of take people through a progression of creation. And since then, the endowment ceremony has been simplified, so they're now just separate rooms that are used for the entire ordinance. But just being able to sort of see in one space so much history and even the evolution of the temple and what it has meant to people and how the practices have even evolved through the years was incredibly helpful for me. The third temple that I went through was in Orem, Utah, which is right next to Provo. And the thing I really loved about this experience is I wasn't with a group, but I was with a couple of Latter-day Saint tour guides and with one of my pastor friends, Pastor Mike Smith from Centerpoint in Orem, which is actually right across the interstate from this temple. And it was a more personal experience. Where the previous tours took 40 to 45 minutes, this tour took, I think, over 2 hours. And a lot of that was my fault because I wouldn't stop asking questions. But it was also because there was the opportunity just to peer a little bit more closely at some of the significant areas to also understand with greater detail what a Latter-day Saint values and experiences as they are conducting temple practices. One of the most memorable things about going through the Orem Temple is just the emphasis on how the building itself is standardized so that it can accommodate these ordinances, which are the same in every temple, but at the same time they are unique in their details, so that their details reflect the geography that every temple exists within. So for example, in the Orem Temple, it was constructed on a land that was formerly fruit orchards. So there were cherry blossoms and cherry trees in almost all of the details, from the moment you walk into the temple all the way through to the sealing room. So the details on the lights and in the art and in the stained glass windows were reflective of this geography and of this theme of a fruit orchard, which I thought was very beautiful in its intentionality and even in what it represented in the growth and the bearing of fruit of these fruit trees tied to significant areas within the temple. And I will say, one of my favorite things after going through all three temples is that learning through repetition gave me clarity on even the progression that takes place in the temple. That there's a baptismal and the basin on top of the oxen, which was the same in all three temples, and yet each room was still pretty unique in some of its decor and aesthetic. And then beyond that, a confirmation room where there's the laying on of hands to receive the Holy Ghost. And then certain other rooms for preparation, an initiatory room where they're sort of cleansing symbolism that takes place as one continues to go through the various areas of the temple. There were preparation rooms for weddings and waiting rooms for weddings. And then, of course, the endowment room, which was set up with seating and a curtain and an altar. And beyond the curtain in all of these endowment rooms was the fixtures that were necessary for some of the more sacred or secretive aspects of what takes place in the temple, with the veil, and beyond that going into what is known as the celestial room. I sat in the celestial room in all three temples, and they were all three very beautiful. In fact, I will say that's one area that struck me and my wife most as we went through the temples, and that is that there is a space designated where one can just go and sit and reflect in the quietness of a designated space. Spaces like that can be elusive in contemporary Protestant or evangelical buildings. And then, of course, all three temples had multiple sealing rooms where individuals can go to be sealed to their family, to their spouses, and really to experience what many of the tour guides explain to be the culmination or the whole point of the temple. And that is to go through these various ordinances and promises so that families and spouses can be sealed together forever. I think one thing that's really important for me to point out, and that I would really emphasize to my past self who might be wondering what goes on in there, it's not as secretive as it might come across. I have been told by church members that in the past, more was withheld from outsiders about what takes place in the temple than is currently withheld. In fact, when I went through all three of these temples, most of the questions I asked were answered. There were only a couple where the tour guide explained to me that they either didn't know or they weren't able to answer. One of them was in the endowment room as far as what takes place beyond the curtain where the veil exists. The only other place where I felt like I didn't have a ton of clarity was in the St. George Temple. There was an assembly hall with these seats facing one another, and the tour guide and most of the Latter-day Saints that I was with said that this room doesn't exist in all the temples, and there's not a great deal of clarity of what this room even is. So now that I've gone through three temples, I feel I'm more informed to be able to address my past self, who had certain impressions about what Latter-day Saint temples represent. One of those being the impression that I had, and I think a lot of mainstream Christians have, and that is the seemingly veiled nature of what takes place in temples, making it seem like it is something that Joseph Smith instituted and has characteristics of what some people would call a cult. A lot of people will come to me and say, isn't the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints a cult based on the following of this one leader, this one individual, and now these veiled practices that take place in a temple? In my experience learning about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there's actually been less emphasis on Joseph Smith than I was expecting, and from what I understand, even a decreasing focus on Joseph Smith in recent years or even decades within the church, and more of a focus on Jesus. So I know that this video isn't really getting into all the reasons and perceptions and impressions about the church being a cult, but I will say, even just for Latter-day Saints, the veiled nature of temples is something that to sort of feed into that impression. I will say, however, that it does share characteristics with secret societies where there are certain ceremonies that take place and a certain progression that individuals go through and things that are kept sacred and covenants that are made to not reveal things that seem very close to characteristics of a secret society, which is another reason why there might be a little bit of a side-eyed impression from people outside of the church. But again, Latter-day Saints that I've talked to as I've gone through temples and since going through temples have been pretty upfront and open about communicating what takes place other than a few small things, which doesn't eliminate but definitely lessens these characteristics that are associated with the idea of secret societies. I now want to address a more recent past version of myself, and it's a version of myself that launched this channel a couple years ago, because the second video I ever did was in Nauvoo, Illinois, and I really zeroed in on the idea of temples in that video. I articulated to Latter-day Saints why physical temples in the form of buildings are no longer needed from a mainstream Christian perspective. I at that time had no idea that the point of temples was primarily to carry out certain ordinances on behalf of those who have already died. So that's one updated reasons as to why mainline Christians or Protestants don't believe we need temples, because we have a different understanding about what is available to those who have already passed on. Whereas Latter-day Saints believe that someone who dies without receiving the opportunity to receive the plan of salvation can be given the opportunity to accept it in the afterlife, we believe that the opportunity for salvation exists within this life. And if somebody has never heard the gospel or was never given the opportunity to receive it, we leave that in the hands of an almighty, just, and loving God. There are certain mainline Christians who will say that individuals who never had the opportunity to receive the gospel are quite simply just not destined to be in God's presence forever, so they'll be separated from his presence forever. There's also the other school of thinking that says, well, it's a bit of a mystery, and though Jesus is the way to salvation, God is going to deal with each soul justly and righteously, but also lovingly and graciously. So we can leave everyone in the hands of an almighty God, and we're going to let him be the one who chooses who spends eternity with him and who doesn't. Another reason why mainstream Christians don't see a need for temple is because we don't necessarily embrace the idea that what is offered to us in salvation can be augmented in any way. So where Latter-day Saints believe that Jesus is the Son of God and is the only hope for mankind, and that he paid for the sins of the world and made a way back to the Father, they also believe that these saving ordinances, or that this temple work, can provide sort of an augmented or an expanded experience in the afterlife that sort of augments what salvation offers. And that comes in a few different forms, whether it be being sealed to family members for all of eternity, or sealed to a spouse for all of eternity, or the opportunity to enter into the highest level of heaven in the celestial kingdom, even to exaltation, where one can, as a result of carrying out these works, even arrive at or achieve or progress to the place where God himself is. And that's where God came from. That Heavenly Father was once someone who was less progressed, more like us, but has progressed throughout the eons and the ages. Those ideas surrounding salvation are nowhere to be found in our construct, because we believe that the Bible teaches that we are most fulfilled in God's presence alone. And when Adam and Eve at the beginning of time sinned and there was a fracture and a casting out from God's presence, the salvation that Jesus offers is to return to God's presence, to enter back into an all-fulfilling eternal existence with him. And then in the meantime, in this fallen world, we are going to try to find that fulfillment in other things, whether it be certain vices or worldly things or entertainment or power or jobs or money, or maybe even in good things like a spouse or loved ones. We believe all of those things exist within this realm that might give us a certain level of meaning and purpose, but they're not the ultimate objective or goal. They're not fulfilling our ultimate desires. That can only be fulfilled by God and is only able to be healed and restored through Christ and Christ alone. So for me, for example, I had to go through a series of years of situations where I was putting so much hope in my girlfriend, who is now my wife, and believing that all of my meaning and my identity and even my hope was tied to the happiness that she and I could achieve. And the Lord really invited me to release that, to surrender that to him, that he is my ultimate source of fulfillment, meaning, identity, and hope. And by relinquishing my wife into his hands, I am able to more fully experience what he has to offer me. That in the meantime, according to Ephesians chapter 5, I can still experience a level of intimacy that is greater and more powerful than anything else I can experience on earth. But really, that experience in and of itself is really just a foretaste or a representation of the fulfillment that I will receive when I'm in God's presence for eternity. So for me, the idea of being sealed to my wife for eternity, after already working through the need to surrender my wife and to find my ultimate fulfillment in him, in a sense feels like a step backwards, where everything that I have that I hold dear, that will eternally hold me and fulfill me and give me peace, is found in God and God alone. Now, I do believe and hope that I will be with my wife for eternity, but it's not going to be in this marital sense where marital things are going to be taking place. It's that we will both be co-experiencing the eternal hope and fulfillment of God's love and peace with one another. So being that mainstream Christians, specifically Protestant evangelicals, focus so much on what we see as the call throughout the scriptures to surrender ourselves, surrender our lives, and even surrendering our stuff, surrendering our relationships, and putting everything in his hands because he is the ultimate source of what is all fulfilling. What I've seen going through the temple, it doesn't successfully augment the hope and the fulfillment, the meaning, the purpose, and the desires that I have already completely in what Jesus has done for me and what he has offered for me. And why the idea of the need for temples would be a pretty hard sell in mainstream Christianity. And just to punctuate that point, which is sort of a little bit of a distinct reason as to why mainstream Christians don't see the need for temples, is because we have a bit of a different idea of what constitutes paradise or eternity or heaven. Whereas Latter-day Saints think that the optimal post-life existence is one where we are continuing to progress. Our idea in mainstream Christianity of paradise is less about continuing to progress and more about eternal rest. We believe that the scriptures clearly teach that when we go beyond this life and we fully receive all that God has to offer us through Jesus as his heirs, that what we are experiencing is a peace. In the Jewish sense, it's shalom. It's a fullness. It is a completeness. It is an all fulfillment in the presence of God. That idea of rest is paradise, not ongoing progression. Maybe one way that I could word it is tied to some sermons that I have preached on heaven, that heaven and paradise is not as much about a place, it's about a person of Jesus. And in my experience going through the temples, I would tweak that a little bit to say, we don't believe that heaven or paradise is about a process or about progression, but is about the person of Jesus and being in his presence for all of eternity. Now, that doesn't mean that we believe that we're going to be just in stasis mode and that we're just going to be sitting on clouds playing harps. I believe that it's going to be unimaginably exciting and adventurous, but most importantly, all fulfilling in his presence at rest. Much of what I appreciate about what Latter-day Saints are desiring to ascertain after going through the endowment ceremony of a celestial room, a place in God's presence where one can simply be at rest and to experience that communion with him. This is where I do see a beautiful alignment. Latter-day Saints wanting to have a space that represents and proclaims the holiness of God and his invitation for us to enter and be a part of that. Even though I don't believe temples are necessary, I can appreciate that desire. Now, I think it's really important for me to point out that just because I've gone on 3 temple tours doesn't make me an expert in all things temple. I recognize I have a lot to learn, and there were probably some of you watching this video screaming at the screen saying, but you don't understand, there's so much more. I believe you. I'm going to continue to learn about everything I can, not just about temples, but about all these different aspects to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I hope that you'll continue to learn with me, that you like this video, subscribe, support me on Patreon if you want. If not, it's not a big deal. Let's just keep learning with one another and learning from one another. And until next time, I'll see you later, Saints.